Hi friends, tonight I invite you to close your eyes and take a slow, gentle journey with me, not to a land of dragons or fairy spells, but to a place that once rang with the cries of the crowd, the clash of steel, and the thunder of history itself. We are going to ancient Rome, but not the Rome of emperors and politics. No, this is a story of a single soul, an ordinary person, a spectator, seated among thousands in a sea of marble and sun, witnessing the spectacle of the Colosseum. Let us begin then, as the first pale gold light of dawn slips over the rooftops of a living empire. The journey began on a crisp spring morning, the kind when Rome itself seems to breathe more slowly. The marble facades still cool with night, and a breeze from the Tiber carries the scent of wet stone and early bread. From the Via Appia the traveller approached, not a noble nor a senator, but a craftsman's son. His name, like a pebble swept away by centuries, has been forgotten. And yet, he walked with quiet purpose. With each step, the ground beneath his sandals told a story, smooth stones worn by legionnaires and slaves alike, nobles and tradesmen, poets and thieves. The city stirred around him. The low bray of donkeys, the clipped tones of merchants setting up stalls, and the echo of laughter from a balcony above. But one sound rose, above the rest. It was a hum, distant yet deep, like the slow awakening of a living giant. The Colosseum, though hidden from view by twisting streets and crowded tenements, made its presence known. The stories he had heard were always grand, almost unreal. It was said that the arena could seat over 50,000. That shade sails, called velaria, could be pulled across the open roof like a sky-drawn curtain. That wild beasts, lions from Numidia, tigers from the east, had been brought to its sandy floor. That men had died there by the hundreds, beneath 1,000 gazes. But now, the stories would no longer be enough. Today, he would see it for himself. At the top of a modest hill, he paused. Between the cypress trees, Rome spread out below him, its 7 hills bathed in the gentle gold of morning. And there, just beyond the curve of the Palatine, it stood. The Colosseum, vast, unshaken, as though it had risen not from human hands, but from the earth itself. Pale cream and tawny brown, its arches opened like the eyes of a watchful beast. Each, one perfectly measured, stacked 3 stories high. From this distance, the people entering it looked like ants. Yet even the ants paused, some with heads bowed, before stepping into its embrace. The young man's breath caught in his throat. He could feel it already, not fear exactly, but a trembling expectation, as if the air around him had grown heavier, more sacred. He touched the carved token in his pouch, olive wood, smooth from wear, stamped with his entry gate and section number, a gift from his uncle, passed wordlessly over supper 2 nights ago. He walked on. As the Colosseum grew closer, the city narrowed, streets tightened, buildings huddled, yet the crowd thickened. Families pressed forward, children perched on shoulders. Vendors hawked sweet dates and honeyed nuts. Even the beggars were silent now, watching the flow of humanity surge toward a single point. He found himself walking beside a man in a coarse tunic, leading 2 boys by hand, and a woman in fine purple dye, speaking in hushed Latin to her servant. Here, the classes brushed shoulders, drawn together not by status, but by shared spectacle. When the arena finally rose before him in full, it stole all words. It towered above. The travertine blocks shimmered in the sunlight, a gentle heat rising. From their surface, statues once stood in each archway, now replaced by shadows and whispers. The sheer magnitude was overwhelming, yet it did not intimidate. It invited, not like a temple, demanding reverence, but like a memory long buried, waiting to be reawakened. He joined the line at his gate. The token in his hand was inspected by a young attendant in white, who nodded once and waved him through. And then came the tunnel. Cool, curved, and wide enough for dozens to pass, the corridor led inward. Torches flickered from bronze holders. The walls bore faint images: laurels, chariots, birds. Some sections were covered in graffiti, names scratched by proud spectators, lovers' initials entwined in crude hearts, or crude sketches of gladiators. The tunnel curved gently upward, and then, light. He stepped into the seating tier. The arena opened like a vast bowl before him. Sunlight poured down from the rim, where the uppermost arches framed blue sky. The sand of the arena below was smooth and golden, untouched as yet by blood or foot. Around it rose row after row of stone seating, in perfect ellipses, tier upon tier, everyone already filling with people. And above it all, stretched across with great care, the velarium, the great awning sails, waved like floating linen clouds. They fluttered slightly in the wind, casting mottled shade over sections of the crowd. He found his seat, a few rows above the arena floor, close enough to see the trapdoors and painted wooden lifts hidden behind false stones. He sat, and he listened. For a long moment, he heard only the collective breath of thousands, soft murmurs, shifting cloth, a child's laughter echoing down the stone. The spectacle had not yet begun, but even in this quiet, something ancient stirred. He looked to his left, where a young girl was cradled in her mother's lap, eyes wide with wonder. To his right, an older man leaned on a cane, whispering to no one. Each face was turned inward. Each mind imagined what was to come. The Colosseum waited. So did he. In that hush, in that marble cradle of noise not yet born, the traveller became a part of something greater. Not just a visitor, not just a spectator, a witness. To what, he did not yet know. From his place among the lower tiers, the young man watched the amphitheatre stir to life. At first, it was only the rustling of tunics and the soft scrape of sandals along stone. But soon, a gentle rhythm took hold, a rising murmur that swelled, like a tide against the curved walls. He had arrived early, as many did, to claim his seat and witness the day unfold from its very first breath. Around him, the marble rows filled slowly. Some spectators arrived alone, others in pairs or in clusters, laughing and speaking in hushed tones, their voices lost in the vast dome of open sky above. The seats were divided, not by accident, but by rigid law and ancient order. Nearest the arena sat the most honoured: senators, magistrates, priests, and noble families. Their togas were crisp, their sandals finely tooled. Behind them came the equestrian class, merchants of great success, veterans rewarded with privilege, and still farther back, the common citizens, artisans, shopkeepers, labourers, each finding their place among their kind. At the very top, beneath the rafters and sun-drenched wind, stood the poor, the slaves, and the women, whose view was distant but still a part of the great whole. Though divided, all eyes were drawn to the centre. There, the arena floor lay untouched, bathed in morning light. A thin layer of sand covered wooden panels, beneath which a vast network of tunnels and cages waited. Even now, faint noises could be heard, chains shifting, wood groaning, as beasts and men prepared for their unseen roles. But before blood could be spilled or battle joined, the sacred rites had to be observed. From a small gate near the imperial entrance, a slow procession began. First came the flautists, young men in white robes, playing soft, haunting melodies on long silver pipes. Their notes echoed like the calls of distant birds, weaving through the rising murmur of the crowd. Next came the incense bearers, draped in red and gold, swinging bronze censers that left a trail of thick, sweet smoke in their wake. The air changed. The scent of roasted almonds and wine from the morning's vendors was now joined by frankincense and myrrh, sacred offerings to the gods of fate and death. The crowd quieted, not with command, but with reverence. Then came the priests, draped in long, ivory robes, their heads crowned with wreaths of laurel and olive. They carried vessels of oil and water. Some murmured prayers in low tones. Others raised their hands to the sky, invoking the blessings of Jupiter, Mars, and Nemesis, the goddess of retribution. At the center of the arena stood a small stone altar, simple and ancient. The priests circled it, then began the ritual. With solemn precision, they poured libations upon the stone, wine for the gods, oil for the spirits of the arena, and water for the souls of those who would die. One priest knelt and scattered barley upon the sand, whispering the old words meant to bind the earth and sky in pact. A white bull was led forward. Its coat was shining, brushed until it gleamed like polished marble. Its eyes, dark and patient, blinked slowly beneath a garland of flowers. The crowd watched in absolute silence as the chief priest approached. He raised a small, curved blade. The moment was still. Then swift, almost gentle, the motion, and the bull fell. Blood spread across, the sand like dark ink. A gasp moved through the stands, not of horror, but of recognition. The sacrifice had been accepted. Above them, in the emperor's private box, a flutter of movement signaled the next phase. Though the emperor himself had not yet arrived, his presence was already felt. His guards stood in gleaming armor, their crested helmets catching the sun. Beneath the canopy of purple silk that shaded his seat, senators adjusted their garments and exchanged words with practiced gravity. Elsewhere, the crowd resumed its noise, but it was different now. Louder, yes, but charged with purpose. Vendors moved through the aisles calling out in melodic Latin, "Dates from Arabia! Almonds in honey! Cups of cold vinegar wine!" Children climbed onto parents' laps. Friends waved to one another from across the rows. Laughter echoed from the upper tiers, while the lower ones buzzed with whispered wagers and speculation. Who would fight today? What beast would be revealed? Would the famed Retiarius, the net fighter, return from his last narrow escape? Would the emperor give the signal of mercy or demand the sword? Our young man listened, but said little. He watched, the faces around him, eyes alight, brows furrowed in excitement. He wondered at how all these people from so many walks of life had come together to share this one fleeting day, to witness, to remember. He turned his gaze upward. The velarium shifted gently overhead, pulled by thick ropes controlled by skilled sailors atop the massive rigging towers. The wind teased the fabric, casting flickers of shade across the stands, cooling the sun's glare just enough to offer comfort. The sails rippled like the wings of a sleeping giant, restful but vast. Then a horn sounded, not loud, but deep, measured, a sound that seemed to come from the bones of the Colosseum itself. All talk ceased. All heads turned toward the eastern gate, the largest of them all, known simply as the Gate of Triumph. It stood shut, but the air before it shimmered with heat and silence. The first act was about to begin. The silence after the horn was a kind of breath, a pause taken by the Colosseum itself. Even the children ceased to fidget. Even the birds that circled overhead flew wider, slower arcs, as if they too were waiting. And then, the gate began to rise. Its iron-banded doors, carved with images of Mars and myth, groaned upon their hinges. Light poured into the darkness beyond. A figure stepped forward, alone at first, bearing a standard high above his head. The banner flapped in the warm wind, red and gold silk, bearing the insignia of the Ludus Magnus, one of Rome's most prestigious gladiator schools. The crowd responded at once. A cheer rose, not yet a roar, but a warm swell, like the sea meeting the shore. Those who recognized the colors murmured names to one another, their excitement rippling outward through the rows. Behind the standard bearer came the parade. First, the musicians. Trumpeters with coiled bronze instruments raised them high and let loose a jubilant fanfare that echoed along the stone walls, bright and proud. Drummers followed, pounding steady rhythms that made hearts beat in time. Then, the gladiators. 2 by 2, They marched, each man gleaming with oil, their skin bronzed by sun and labor. Their armor caught the light, crested helmets, polished greaves, and ornate chest plates reflecting gold and silver. They carried their weapons across their bodies, tridents, nets, short swords, curved blades, all symbols of their trade, yet not drawn in aggression. Today, in this procession, they were not yet fighters. They were symbols, living statues, embodiments of honor and fate. Each pair wore different gear, representing the various styles of combat. There was the murmillo, with his heavy rectangular shield and fish-crested helm, the secutor, smooth-helmed to evade a net's catch, the hoplomachus, armored like a Greek spearman, and the dimachurus, twin-sword wielder whose every step seemed a dance of anticipation. Behind them marched younger men, apprentices and understudies, faces taut with awe and anxiety. Some blinked in the sun. Others stared out into the crowd, searching perhaps for a familiar face or simply grounding themselves in the vastness of the arena. Then came the beasts, cages on wheels, draped in woven. Tapestries were pulled slowly by oxen and slaves. From within, low growls and snarls whispered through the air. The crowd leaned forward, craning necks to glimpse what lay behind the bars. A lion, golden and massive, paced back and forth, its eyes like twin embers. In another cage, a bear, huge and shaggy, its breath fogging the iron slats. Still more followed. Leopards, panthers, even an ostrich flapping its wings indignantly. None would be loosed yet. Their time would come later. A hush fell again. A second gate opened, smaller, yet richly adorned with imperial symbols. A man stepped forth. He wore no armor, but a robe of deep crimson edged in ivory, and his presence alone was enough to cause the crowd to rise, row by row, in silent reverence. It was the editor, the sponsor of the games. In this case, a high-ranking senator named Marcus Septimus Varro, appointed by the emperor himself to oversee the day's events. He raised one hand in greeting, and the crowd responded with applause, not wild or raucous, but measured and full of expectation. The editor gave a short address. His voice, carried by the natural acoustics of the stone bowl, rang out clearly. He thanked the emperor. He honored the gods. He named the schools of the gladiators and praised their discipline and sacrifice. He promised the people of Rome a day of justice, spectacle, and glory. Then he turned, slowly, and raised a small wand of ivory. He pointed it toward the arena floor. The first act would begin. It was customary to open with mock battles, demonstrations meant to entertain without bloodshed. They allowed the crowd to warm, to settle, to appreciate the art of combat before the brutal truth arrived. Two young men stepped forward, bare-chested, with wooden swords and wicker shields. They saluted the editor, then the emperor's empty box, and finally, the crowd. They began to spar. Their movements were practiced, elegant even, each blow carefully controlled, each dodge performed with flair. The crowd responded with whistles and laughter, clapping when a particularly graceful maneuver was executed. Our young man watched, a soft smile tugging at his lips. He could see it clearly now. The performance behind the spectacle, the layers of tradition, entertainment, and expectation woven into every step. These were not just fights, they were acts, they were rituals. And the audience was not merely watching, it was participating. Their reactions fed the rhythm of the day. After the mock battles, the animals were paraded once more. This time, some were led from their cages by skilled handlers. The lion walked beneath a chain of brass, its eyes never leaving the crowd. The bear, surprisingly docile, sat on its haunches, while a clownish performer danced beside it. But not all animals were so tame. A leopard broke from its leash for an instant, only a moment, but it was enough. The crowd gasped, spears bristled, guards closed in. The handler, calm and careful, soothed the beast back into control. The crowd laughed with relief, and with that, the tension was set. All had been shown: strength, beauty, danger, discipline. The day had been officially opened. The first blood spilled in ritual only, but soon it would be real. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows beneath the tiers of the Colosseum. The velarium shifted, its vast sails catching the breeze as if responding to the building tension. The crowd murmured, leaned forward. Beneath the awning's gentle shade, eyes squinted toward the center of the arena, where two figures stood in stillness. It was time for the morning duels. These were not the climactic battles reserved for the later hours. Those were saved for the elite. But these morning contests were still real, still lethal, and for many, they were the most honest of all. The two combatants faced each other in silence. One, a mumillo, was broad-shouldered, clad in heavy armor and wielding a rectangular shield and short gladius. The other, a thraex, fought with a curved seeker and a small shield shaped like a crescent moon. His helmet bore a plume of dyed horsehair, a striking splash of red against the pale arena sand. Before the fight could begin, both men turned to face the editor. They raised their weapons in salute. Then, as tradition demanded, they raised them, once more toward the emperor's box, even though it stood empty today. Still, the gesture mattered. It honored the structure of power, the unseen eyes, the divine thread woven into Rome's sense of destiny. Morituri te salutant, they said together. We who are about to die salute you. The phrase carried on the wind like a thread of music, repeated lowly by members of the crowd, a collective hum of remembrance and recognition. Some in the stands repeated it softly, almost reverently, and then the signal. A white cloth dropped from the editor's hand. At once, the thraex lunged. He was fast, faster than most expected. His smaller shield gave him mobility, and his curved blade darted forward like a snake's tongue. The mumillo raised his heavy scutum and caught the blow, the impact ringing out across the stone arena. Steel clanged against steel. Dust rose around them. The mumillo countered with a brutal thrust, slow but powerful, aiming for the ribs. The thraex danced back, circling, trying to stay to the mumillo's right side, his weak side, where the shield did not reach. The crowd was alive now. Shouts rang out, some urging the mumillo to press forward, others calling for the thraex to stay nimble. Children leaned over stone railings. Old veterans nodded in appreciation, watching the tactics unfold with practiced eyes. Our young man, seated near the arena's edge, found himself gripping the edge of his seat. He had never seen a real fight, not like this. He had seen street brawls in the markets, had broken up a few when tensions ran high. But this was not a brawl. This was measured, structured, controlled and yet wild. It was art painted in blood and movement. The thraex lunged again, this time slicing low. The mumillo staggered, sand kicked into his eyes. A gasp from the crowd. Blood. A shallow cut on the leg, darkening quickly. First blood. It was tradition for the duel to continue unless a fighter yielded or was clearly bested. Wounds were part of the game, but first blood held meaning. It showed initiative, precision, and to the watching crowd, it was the moment the fight became real. The mumillo roared and surged forward. He swung his shield, not to block but to strike, slamming it into the thraex's side. The smaller man crumpled briefly, falling to a knee. The mumillo raised his sword, ready to bring it down, but the thraex rolled away at the last instant, sand trailing behind him. The crowd erupted. There was no single cheer. Instead, it was like a sea of emotion. Waves of delight, tension, laughter and fear crashing into each other. Some clapped, others stood. Still more simply, watched in silence, eyes wide, hands pressed to their lips. The editor raised his hand, palm flat, commanding stillness. Both men froze. He stood slowly, allowing the moment to linger. It was clear now that the thraex was wounded, a gash along his arm, likely from the earlier shield strike. He still held his weapon, but blood darkened the sand beneath him. The Murmillo stood tall, breathing hard but steady. Then came the ritual of the sword. When one fighter was clearly disadvantaged and the duel could go no further, the editor had the power to decide the outcome. But tradition allowed the people to speak first. And so he turned, not to the wounded man, not to the victor, but to the crowd. He extended his arm, hand flat once again, then slowly rotated his wrist, thumb extended. Up or down? In truth, the historical accuracy of the thumb signals is debated. But in this moment, as thousands watched with held breath, the meaning was clear. Mercy or death? The Murmillo waited, sword raised. The Thraex knelt, eyes lowered, offering no plea. The crowd murmured. Some voices called for mercy, admiring the Thraex's skill and resilience. Others, eager for the thrill, cried for the final blow. Hands lifted, some with thumbs out, others pointing down, caught in the wild current of judgment. The editor waited. Then, with a firm, deliberate motion, he turned his thumb downward. The arena fell still. The Murmillo stepped forward, adjusted his grip, and delivered a swift, clean strike to the side of the neck. The Thraex fell, his body folding like cloth. The sand drank the blood. A pair of attendants rushed forward with cloaks and poles, wrapping the body swiftly and dragging it away through a hidden side gate. The arena was smoothed again by slaves, with rakes and brooms, as though nothing had happened, and the games continued. The sun now hung high, nearly overhead, casting straight shadows through the Colosseum's upper arches. The velarium creaked gently as it shifted, its ropes groaning with strain. Sailors, positioned atop the great structure, adjusted the ropes, to better shield the audience below from the bright Roman sun. Still, the heat pressed down. A dry warmth softened only by the breeze that slipped through the upper corridors. From his seat near the lower tiers, the young man felt the stillness settle like a cloth. There would be no more fights for at least an hour. Not because the crowd was tired. Far from it. The air was still thick with excitement. But Rome, for all its might and spectacle, also knew the value of pause. The games, like the city itself, moved in rhythms, moments of thunder followed by moments of hush, and so the people ate. Vendors, who had been circulating the outer corridors for hours, now entered the stands in greater numbers. Each one bore trays strapped around their shoulders, laden with delicacies, meant to tempt every class of Roman. From the upper levels drifted the scent of roasted chickpeas, fried until golden and dusted with sea salt. Along the middle tiers, trays of olives, green, black, and purple, were passed hand to hand, accompanied by bundles of flatbread wrapped in fig leaves to keep them soft. Closer to the arena floor, the wealthier citizens opened their own baskets. These were brought by slaves or carried from nearby villas, packed with cold poultry, fruit compotes, spiced cheese, and small amphorae of watered wine. The young man reached into his satchel. He pulled out a modest meal, a handful of dates, 2 boiled eggs, and a small round of goat cheese wrapped in waxed cloth. He laid them in his lap, unhurried, savouring each step. The eggs, warm from the morning sun, were easy to peel. The cheese was sharp and crumbly, salty in a way that made the dates taste sweeter. Around him, the crowd changed tone. Voices rose, in laughter. Songs, half sung and half spoken, drifted through the tiers. In the very back, someone played a lyre, its soft strings barely audible over the murmur. Children, restless from the earlier silence, chased one another in the narrow, rose until scolded gently by their elders. From one group of merchants came a game of dice, played with loud claps and slaps on a board. From another, men argued good-naturedly about the outcome of the next match. Bets were exchanged, small sums mostly, though sometimes more, and each man spoke with the certainty that only midday wine can provide. Our traveller watched it all. He was used to the markets of Rome, to the scent of the Tiber, to the clang of tools and the chatter of tradesmen. But this was different. This was a community suspended in time. All had gathered to witness, yes, but also to share, to eat, to rest, to exist for a few short hours as one body beneath the sun. Somewhere behind him, a small drama unfolded, and older man dressed in faded green scolded a younger boy for trying to sneak closer to the arena floor. The boy argued, hands gesturing wildly, insisting he had dropped a coin. The man, amused rather than angry, finally gave the boy a copper sesterce of his own and sent him back up with a pat on the shoulder. Such moments, though tiny, mattered. They formed the true heart of the Colosseum. Not the blood, not the battles, but the people. The lovers holding hands, the friends passing wine, the strangers clapping at the same sudden joke. A voice called out beside him. Good spot for a first time. The young man turned. The speaker was middle-aged, his tunic faded, but clean, his sandals dusted with travel. He held a half-empty flask and a bunch of grapes, which he plucked at absently. First time? He asked again. The young man nodded. Yes. The man smiled. You'll remember it. Even when you're old and full of complaints, you'll remember the way the sand looked in the light. He pointed toward the arena. See that line there where they raked it smooth? Looks like nothing now. But soon, he left the sentence unfinished, letting the silence carry the weight. The two sat together for a while, sharing food, not speaking unless the moment called for it. Above them, a trumpet sounded once, not a call to battle, but a reminder. The break would soon end. Around the arena, slaves with wide brooms began to sweep again, collecting refuse, smoothing footprints, resetting the stage. In one corner, a man poured water into the sand, keeping the dust low. The scent of wet earth mingled with the lingering aroma of food. The young man packed the last of his cheese and stood for a moment to stretch. His back ached slightly from the stone, but he welcomed the feeling. It was proof that he had truly been here, had sat, eaten, and felt the wind of Rome across his face. From the upper tier came a sudden cheer. No reason, no announcement, just a burst of energy. Perhaps someone had returned to their seat with a jug of wine. Perhaps a joke had rippled across rows, but it spread, warm and infectious, like fire catching on dry olive wood. Laughter followed, and then more trumpets, a series of 3 notes, low and steady. The crowd shifted once more. Meals finished, cups drained, games set aside. People returned to their seats, brushed crumbs from their laps, leaned forward with fresh anticipation. Midday was done. The games would resume. The air was warmer now, thick with sunlight and anticipation. The breeze still stirred, though less often, and the sails above flapped softly, their edges tugging against the sky like tired wings. In the arena below, the sand had darkened slightly, damp, from water meant to hold the dust down, but still gleamed under the afternoon glow. Another blast of trumpets. A line of armed men entered through the eastern gate, not gladiators, but hunters. Their armor was lighter, built for speed and maneuverability. They wore short tunics reinforced with leather, and their faces were uncovered, letting the crowd see their expressions clearly. This was by design. Unlike the gladiators, who fought each other in intimate combat, these men, the bestiari, would face creatures, wild things, unpredictable things, and the crowd wanted to see their eyes. They wanted to see courage or fear. The bestiari fanned out across the arena. Each carried a spear or a javelin or a curved hunting blade. A few bore nets or lassos, and behind them, at strategic points, stood men with bows, ready should anything slip control. Then, with a deep mechanical groan, a platform in the center of the arena began to rise. Beneath the sand lay the hypogem, a complex underground system of pulleys, lifts and tunnels. From this hidden world came the first beast of the afternoon. It emerged slowly, cageless. A massive boar, its shoulders thick with muscle, its tusks yellowed and jagged. It blinked against the sunlight, snorting, its breath steaming in the open air. The crowd cheered as it turned once, twice, stamping the sand with heavy hooves. One of the hunters approached. He held no shield, only a spear and a coil of rope. The crowd fell into a hush. Even the laughter of moments earlier disappeared into the vast bowl of stone. The boar charged. It came in a blur of dust and fury, its growl like thunder rolling low across the floor. The hunter stood his ground until the last instant, then stepped aside, thrusting the spear low into the beast's side. The crowd erupted, not for the kill, it was not yet dead, but for the bravery. The boar spun, blood matting its side, and charged again. A second hunter joined the fray, circling wide, driving the animal back toward the center. Together they moved like dancers, clumsy and tense, but oddly graceful. At last, the final blow was struck. The boar collapsed with a shudder, legs folding beneath it, breath slowing into stillness. The crowd applauded, some rising to their feet, others clapping slow and solemn. The body was dragged away, a thin trail of blood marking its passage, but there was no pause. The venatio continued. From another lift, a leopard emerged, sleek and silent. Its muscles rippled beneath golden fur marked with dark rosettes. It did not charge. Instead, it prowled, eyes low, tail twitching. The crowd's mood changed instantly, from admiration to unease. This was not a creature of brute strength. This was a killer. A pair of hunters advanced, nets ready. One tossed his net wide, too early. The leopard leapt over it, landing silently, then struck. A blur of claws, a flash of blood. The hunter cried out, falling hard. The other drove his spear, connecting with a shoulder. The leopard screamed, a high, chilling sound that made even seasoned watchers wince. The beast twisted and bolted, not toward the attackers, but toward the crowd. Up the inner wall it leapt, claws scrambling for purchase. A collective gasp surged through the Colosseum, but before it could climb high, an archer loosed his arrow. Straight and silent, it struck just behind the foreleg. The leopard dropped, twitched once, then lay still. The crowd exhaled. Some cheered, others murmured uneasily. The boundary between stage and spectator had been too nearly crossed, a reminder perhaps that the wild was never truly tame. Still, the show went on. More beasts followed, a pair of wolves darting through the dust in perfect unison, a bear, lumbering and massive, who took several spears before falling, an ostrich, whose wild-eyed sprinting drew more laughter than fear. Each animal was introduced with fanfare, and each had its moment. And yet, our young man began to feel a shift, not in the crowd, not in the spectacle, but in himself. At first, he had been caught in the excitement, the awe, but now, as the sixth beast collapsed in the sand, a slow heaviness settled in his chest. It wasn't disgust. Rome had long accepted that such things were part of life. It wasn't sorrow exactly. It was weariness, a quiet realization that the beauty of the wild, when brought into chains and forced into combat, became something else, something hollow. He looked around. Many still cheered, their faces alight with thrill. Children clapped, couples pointed. But here and there, others sat quietly, as he did. Not appalled, not outraged, simply still. Another trumpet sounded. The beasts had all been shown. The sand was raked once again, stained now with more than blood. Scattered feathers, broken spears, and the haunting scent of musk and death. The afternoon sun had begun to lean westward. The velarium was pulled tighter, the light shifting across the stands. Slaves walked the aisles with baskets of lavender and myrrh, tossing handfuls of petals and scented powder into the air to sweeten the scent. Some in the crowd welcomed it. Others waved it away, eager for the next act. but all knew what came next. The Venaciones were over. The final contests of the day, the true heart of the spectacle, were about to begin. The hour had changed. A deeper shade of gold now touched the edges of every stone, every arch, every spear. Shadows grew longer, stretching like fingers across the sand. The scent of lavender and myrrh still lingered in the air, though fainter, now overtaken by dust and sweat and warm anticipation. Trumpets rang out once more, not the sharp call of urgency used in battle, nor the fanfare that had greeted the beast hunts, but something slower, deeper, almost reverent. The veteran gladiators were entering the arena. The eastern gate opened, and with it came a hush, not silence exactly, but the soft murmur of reverence, like a prayer whispered across a temple. And then they stepped forth. 6 men, evenly spaced, marched into the sunlight. No music followed them, no banners. They needed none. Each man bore the quiet gravity of survival, not just of battle, but of years spent living on the edge of death. Their armor was worn but polished. Helmets gleamed despite the nicks. Shields bore the dents of remembered strikes. Swords hung heavy, not like symbols, but tools. Their bodies were sculpted not by leisure, but by necessity, thick with scars, muscles hard, not from training alone, but from healing. Each one had a name known to the crowd. These were not anonymous men. They were champions, survivors of more matches than most would dare count. Their faces, those not hidden behind masks, had been etched into coins, painted on tavern walls, whispered over in the flickering candlelight of Roman homes, and the people responded, not with wild cheering, not yet. Instead, they stood, row by row, like a wave moving through marble. The audience rose to their feet, not ordered to, not commanded, but compelled, as though to remain seated would be a kind of disrespect. The gladiators stood at the center of the arena. Then, one by one, they turned. They faced the emperor's box, still shaded beneath its purple canopy. Though the emperor had not appeared today, his seat remained a symbol, his presence felt in every breath. Each man raised his weapon in salute. The oldest of them, a retiarius named Dardanus, famous for his net and trident, lifted his chin high, sunlight flashing on the bronze of his arm guard. Behind his mask, no emotion showed, and yet the stillness of his gesture moved something in the hearts of all who watched. Then the matches began. Not all 6 would fight today. Only 2 pairs were chosen. The others stood aside, their roles ceremonial, offering prestige, memory, and a promise that the arena still knew greatness. The first pairing was announced by a herald, his voice carrying with ease across the amphitheater. Gaius of Carthage versus Pollio of the Aventine, a roar from the crowd. Both men were known, though Gaius perhaps more so. A former slave who had risen through brutal matches to become a crowd favorite. His helmet bore a lion crest, and his sword had once belonged to a fallen champion. Pollio, too, had earned respect, not for showmanship, but for precision. Every strike he made was clean, every step measured, a tactician among brawlers. The arena shifted. The sand, smoothed again, bore the weight of their steps. Each man saluted. Each man moved to opposite ends. And then, at the drop of the editor's hand, the match began. Unlike the earlier duels, this was not a dance of nerves. This was war. Gaius charged, his blade a blur. Pollio stepped back, blocked, countered with a sweep. Sand flew. Blades clashed. The force of their collision sent vibrations through the arena floor. Cries erupted from the crowd, some calling names, others just releasing the breath they didn't know they held. The young man in the crowd leaned forward, every moment pulsed with danger. These were not young, impulsive fighters. These were seasoned men who understood not just how to fight, but when. Their bodies carried memory. They anticipated, adapted, punished. Pollio scored the first hit, across Gaius's thigh. A shallow cut, but enough to slow him. Gaius smiled behind his helm. He twisted, turned the injury into momentum, and struck hard at Pollio's side. A grunt, a stumble. Then, a pause. Both men froze, blades hovering, breathing ragged, blood stained their tunics. But neither gave ground. It was clear now. They had fought before. Many times, perhaps. Their rhythms matched too closely. Their eyes met with something that bordered not on hatred, but on deep understanding. A strange, wordless kinship forged through blades and bruises. Then, almost gently, Gaius nodded, and the fight resumed. What followed was not long. A quick feint, a final thrust. Pollio fell, not dead, but disarmed, on one knee. The crowd erupted. Some cheered for Gaius, others for the match itself, and then came the moment of judgment. The editor stood. The Colosseum fell into hush. Gaius stepped back, his chest rising and falling. Pollio knelt, waiting. The editor paused, hand raised. Then, his thumb turned sideways. A rare gesture, a signal that allowed the victor to choose, a symbol of deep respect. Gaius lowered his sword. Pollio would live, the crowd thundered in approval. Not because it had been bloodless, it had not, but because honor had been preserved. Skill had been shown. The gods, perhaps, had been pleased. As the two men exited, shoulder to shoulder, a chant rose, not loud, but steady. Gaius, Gaius, Gaius! It followed them into the tunnel, and the arena fell still once more. The arena had quieted, but the memory of the match still hung heavy in the air. Gaius of Carthage had emerged not just unbroken, but elevated. His movements had been measured, his strikes clean. His opponent, Pollio, though worthy, had fallen. Yet mercy had been granted, and from that mercy, a greater glory was born. The crowd, no longer shouting in frenzy, had settled into a kind of reverent murmur. It was not the sound of riotous joy, but of recognition. There are victories that are loud, and there are those that are deep. This was the latter. As Gaius left the arena floor, the last of the petals thrown in his honor drifted down to the sand. His back was straight, his shoulders squared, his crimson tunic, damp with sweat and blood, clung to his frame. Laurel wreath rested lightly on his brow. Not the imperial crown of an emperor, not the iron of a general, but a circle of green and gold, fragile and fleeting, and yet it meant everything. The passageway he entered was cooler than the arena. Shade welcomed him like a cloak, wrapping his skin in a relief from the sun's fierce glare. Inside the corridor, torchlight flickered from iron brackets on the walls, casting long shadows on the carved stone. Slaves moved aside as he passed. Some bowed their heads, others simply watched, their eyes wide. He was not a master to them, but for this moment, he was a figure of awe. Down the passage, in a chamber tucked behind the scenes, his lanista, the trainer from the Gladiator school, waited. "Gaius," he said simply. No applause, no embrace, just a quiet nod of respect. "I've seen 20 years of games," the lanista continued, "and today you looked like a man who could take the earth by the throat." Gaius said nothing. He sat heavily on a low wooden stool. Water was brought in a bronze basin, and cloths scented with vinegar and crushed thyme. A slave knelt and began to clean. The wound on his leg, just a shallow cut, but enough to sting now that the tension had faded. He winced slightly. The lanista noticed. "You'll fight again," he said, "but not yet. They'll talk about today for weeks." Gaius gave the faintest of nods. Outside, the crowd had moved on. Another match would begin soon. But here, in this little room where the cheers were muffled, the weight of what had occurred settled more clearly. The laurel wreath, though simple, caught the light from a small oil lamp. Its leaves, woven tightly and kissed with gilding, shimmered like fire. It was not made to last. None of it was. But that was never the point. A boy entered, breathless from running. He was one of the arena messengers, cheeks pink, eyes wide with admiration. "Sir," he said quickly, bowing awkwardly. "The editor sends his compliments." And wine. Behind him, a second servant entered, bearing a tray. Upon it stood a single goblet, carved from dark glass, filled with honeyed spiced wine. There was also a small dish of figs, neatly arranged. Gaius reached for the goblet. He held it for a moment before sipping. The sweetness surprised him. For hours, all he had tasted was dust and blood, and the dull tang of iron. The richness of the wine bloomed in his mouth like warmth spreading from a hearth. The servant waited, unsure whether to stay or go. Gaius looked at him. "Have you ever fought?" he asked quietly. The boy blinked. "Me? No, sir." Gaius set the goblet down. "Then don't." The boy hesitated. "But I watch. Every day. I remember every name. Yours first." He seemed proud of this, almost defiant. Gaius studied him, his slender arms, his unscarred hands, his eagerness. Then he offered a tired smile. "There's glory," he said, "but there's also forgetting. The crowd remembers you until the next roar." The boy didn't know how to respond, so he bowed again and left. Later, Gaius stepped out into the open air. The sun was now lower in the sky. The light had turned orange, softer, dustier, casting long beams across the stone corridors. The upper arches of the Colosseum glowed like amber. The laurel wreath remained on his brow. He walked slowly, alone, past the holding pens where beasts had waited, past the murals scratched on the walls by others like him, some still living, many long gone. One, etched in crude lines, caught his eye. Two stick figures locked in combat, beneath the words "Vincit qui patiteur." He conquers, who endures. He traced the words once with his finger. Then he moved on. Back into the hum of the world. Back into a life where, for this one day, he had been more than a fighter. He had been seen. He had been chosen. He had won. And though the sand would be smoothed, again, though the next match would rise and the crowd would find a new name to chant, for a little while longer, he would remain in memory. The arena's roar had softened, but never truly stopped. Between each match came a low murmur, a sound made of sandals on stone, whispers traded between friends, and vendors calling out their final offerings of salted nuts and sweet wine. Yet, in the underbelly of the Colosseum, deeper and quieter, there were places where even the murmur dissolved into stillness. The young man, our traveller, had risen from his seat. The long hours of sitting, watching, clapping, and leaning forward in anticipation had left him stiff. He moved carefully down the steps and into the curved corridor that encircled the seating levels. It was dimmer here, the sunlight reduced to slanted beams falling through tall arches, catching dust that danced slowly through the air. This was the Colosseum's spine, its breath, its memory. Every footstep echoed faintly along the limestone walls, polished smooth by centuries of movement. All around him were others who had also risen, not in a rush, not to leave, but simply to stretch, to breathe, to collect themselves between moments of spectacle. He moved slowly, hands tucked in the folds of his tunic. To his left, a group of older men sat together on a bench built into the stone, their eyes still alight from the previous match. One was recounting the exact moment Gaius dodged Pollio's final strike. His hands danced through the air in imitation, fingers slicing invisible shapes. To his right, a mother gently rocked her sleeping child, bundled tight in a faded wool cloak. She hummed softly, not a lullaby, not quite, but something wordless, soothing. ancient. As he continued walking, the traveller passed small alcoves and recesses. Some held statues, cracked and time-worn, yet elegant in their decay. A Venus with a missing nose, a Mars with his hand broken off, still pointing toward the sky. Others were filled with simple offerings, coins, olive branches, a clay lamp still, glowing softly in a niche where shadows pooled. Someone had left a carved wooden figure of a man with a sword, a charm perhaps for protection or victory. There was reverence here, quiet and unspoken. The arena above was chaos and cheers, but here it was whispers and breath. He paused at one of the archways. Beyond it, the sky glowed orange, the sun dropping lower toward the rooftops of the city. He could see the streets winding like threads, carriages crawling along them, and beyond, the Tiber glinting in the fading light. It all looked so small from here. He leaned against the stone, letting the coolness seep into his arms. His thoughts swirled like smoke, slow and soft. The games were not yet over, but the mood had shifted. The high energy of morning had mellowed into something richer, heavier, not sorrow exactly, but reflection. In the corridor behind him, voices passed in waves. A man recited lines of poetry to his companion, gesturing with theatrical flair. A pair of children giggled, tracing their fingers along the carved patterns in the wall. A vendor pushed a cart of cooled vinegar water, calling softly, "Acetum frigidum, refresh the tongue, cool the blood." But the traveller stayed still. He wasn't tired. He wasn't anxious. He was simply here, in this moment, in this corridor that had carried thousands before him, and would carry thousands more. He remembered the faces, the lion's heavy eyes, full of something not quite rage. The net fighter, younger than he'd expected, face hidden beneath his helmet, yet trembling slightly in his boots. Gaius, standing quiet, not even smiling as the crowd chanted his name. So much noise, and yet, what he remembered most was the silence. The moment before the first blow, the breath before the gate opened, the hush between trumpet calls. He resumed, walking. A few paces ahead, a woman was tracing her fingers along an inscription carved into the stone. Her lips moved silently as she read, "Fortuna fave fortibus." Fortune favors the brave. The words were faded, worn by time, but still legible. She turned as he approached, gave him a gentle nod, and moved on. He paused to read the line again. He thought of what bravery meant here, in this place. Was it the man who stepped into the arena with a blade? The woman who watched her son fight? The editor who chose who lived and who died? Or perhaps it was those who watched and remembered. Further down the corridor, a small shrine stood. It was no more than a simple platform built into the wall, where someone had placed a bowl of water and a string of garlic. Nearby, incense sticks burned, low. An older man stood there, head bowed, fingers laced in prayer. The traveller did not disturb him. Instead, he found a bench near the shrine and sat for a moment, closing his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he saw the arena again. Not as it was, but as it had been a few hours ago. The golden light of morning, the quiet footfalls of the first spectators, the whisper of expectation that hung over the sand. It had all moved so quickly, and yet, sitting here now, it felt like it had stretched into something timeless. He opened his eyes. The corridor was darker now. The torches on the wall flickered more brightly. A trumpet sounded in the distance, one long note, then silence. It would be the final set of matches now. Dusk battles, the last blood. He stood slowly. Others were returning to their seats, their quiet footsteps forming a collective rhythm as they moved back toward the arena's heartbeat. He followed, back through the arch, back into the vast sea of stone, back toward the sand that had been cleared and smoothed again, waiting patiently. The day was not over. not yet. The Colosseum stood golden, not the fresh brightness of morning, nor the dusty warmth of midday, but the deep, honeyed hue of nearing twilight. The arches that crowned the upper levels caught the light like fire. The arena below glowed with a last breath of brilliance just before the sun's descent into the western hills. The trumpet had sounded, once, long and low, a signal that the day's final matches were about to begin. The crowd was quieter now, not subdued, but softened. Hours of heat, noise, food, and feeling had mellowed their voices. Many leaned against one another. Some closed their eyes and reopened them only at the cry of a horn. But none had left. No one left before the dusk matches. They were special, fewer, in number, often bloodier, and somehow more intimate. The young man returned to his seat, the stone cool now beneath him. Around him, the audience was settled into that strange calm that comes after excitement. It was not boredom, it was readiness. A subtle hush overtook the tiers as the eastern gate opened once more. From it stepped a single figure, alone. No partner, no opponent, just one man in full armor carrying a short sword and a large rectangular shield. The herald announced him, voice crisp and clear. Cassian, son of Tiber, provocator by rank, challenger by honor. A provocator, a type of gladiator, often tasked with initiating duels and enforcing discipline among others. Their armor was balanced, sturdy breastplate, visored helmet, greaves. A match of provocatores was always a display of grit and technical mastery. The crowd stirred. Cassian was known, not widely like Gaius, but respected by those who understood the nuances of combat. He was methodical, exact, and many believed him due for a rise in reputation. He stood in the center of the arena, turning once in a slow circle, letting the crowd see him. Then the opposing gate opened, another figure emerged, taller, broader. The herald called, Varius of the East, provocator, freeborn volunteer. A ripple of reaction passed through the audience. A volunteer. They were rare. Most. Gladiators were slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals. But Varius had chosen this. A citizen who had stepped forward of his own will, offering his body to the gods of the arena, seeking fame, or something harder to name. The two men met at the center. They saluted the editor, then turned and saluted the imperial box, though no emperor sat within it. Only a draped chair and a scattering of officials remained. Still, the gesture was required. The editor gave the signal, a downward flick of the hand, and the match began. At first, it was quiet. The men circled, testing one another. The crowd leaned in, breath caught, eyes narrowed. These were not wild swings or showy flourishes. These were precise, deliberate movements, each step calculated, each feint a question. Cassian struck first, a quick jab meant to bait. Varius responded with a shield push, advancing a step and forcing Cassian back. Dust rose gently beneath their feet. Steel hissed against steel. Time moved strangely. Unlike the frantic morning duels, this was a slow, simmering match. It was a conversation, one spoken in clangs and grunts and silences. The crowd watched, not with cheers, but with stillness. Then, a blow. Cassian slipped low and drove his sword against Varius's thigh, a shallow cut, but deep enough to draw blood. The crowd exhaled. Varius staggered, just briefly, but he recovered, swinging wide, driving Cassian off balance. For a moment, it seemed the momentum had shifted, but Cassian did not falter. He moved, like a tide, steady and inevitable. He waited for Varius's next charge, then stepped aside, turned, and delivered a blow across his back. Varius fell to one knee. The crowd rose. The herald took a breath, but held it. The match was not yet done. Varius looked up, blood dripping down his calf, face streaked with sweat. And then, with a guttural cry, he stood. He raised his sword and charged. The next exchange was brutal, a flurry of strikes, shields clashing like thunder. blades sparking under the sun's final gaze. Then, at last, Cassian disarmed his opponent. The sword clattered to the sand. Varius fell once more. On his knees now, chest heaving, hands open. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not speak. He waited. Cassian stood over him and looked up. To the editor, the crowd held its breath. Would this be mercy, as it had been for Pollio earlier? Or would dusk end in blood? The editor's hand rose, and then turned, slowly, deliberately, thumb. Down! Gasps. Cassian hesitated. Then he stepped forward, placed one hand on Varius's shoulder, and delivered a clean thrust to the heart. Varius collapsed without sound. No scream, no flinch, just stillness. The crowd responded not with cheers but applause, slow, respectful, the way a theatre audience might respond to a moving performance. The attendants entered quickly. They cloaked the body, removed the weapons, raked the sand smooth again. The sun at last dipped beneath the arches. A final trumpet sounded. The games were over. The young man did not speak. He did not stand yet. He looked down at the place where Varius had fallen. Already the marks were gone, but he would remember. He would carry the shape of that match, the feel of that hush, the way the light had struck the helmet. The games were done, but the memory had only begun. The final trumpet had long since faded into silence. What remained was the low sound of bodies shifting, sandals scraping stone, cloaks shaken out, and sighs, deep, full, and human. The kind of sighs that follow an entire day lived all at once. The young man lingered in his seat a little longer. The stone was warm beneath him, cooled just enough by the setting sun to soothe his aching muscles. He let his eyes trace the stillness of the arena below, now empty, except for the faint marks in the sand where blood had dried and footprints had crossed in frenzied combat. Even the breeze had changed, gentler now. It moved through the velarium, sails above, which had begun to draw inward, folding like wings after flight. The great canvas, once spread wide to shield from sun, now bowed to the coming night. A final light touched the uppermost arches of the Colosseum. It shimmered there like the edge of a candle flame before extinguishing. The young man rose. All around him others did the same, not in a rush, not in panic, but in a kind of reverent procession, as though leaving a temple, not a battlefield. Conversations began again, low and slow, like a river easing back into its course after passing a dam. Did you see the look on Varius's face? I thought Cassian would yield. He should have been spared. They'll talk about that match for weeks. The voices blended together, thick with awe, thick with the weight of having witnessed something unforgettable. Children were gathered. Leftover food was brushed into cloth bundles. Tokens were tucked back into pouches as souvenirs. One man picked up a splintered wooden sword and carried it reverently, as though it had been forged from gold. The stairs moved with bodies, dozens at a time, but no one jostled, no one shouted. It was a collective descent, like water pouring through a wide mouth of stone. They flowed downward into the inner corridor, where the light grew dim and torches flickered with new significance. The young man entered the shadowed passage once more. He passed a couple walking slowly, arms linked, a group of boys, red-cheeked and bright-eyed, still arguing about which gladiator was fastest. An older woman who walked alone, leaning slightly on the wall, her sandals quiet against the stone. He glanced toward one of the recesses where a torch burned beside an old statue of Jupiter. Someone had left an offering, a small ceramic lamp, a twist of barley, and a copper coin. The statue's eyes, though worn and chipped, seemed to watch the departing crowd with distant amusement. Further down, near one of the wide arches that opened to the outside, he paused. There, framed by the curve of ancient stone, the city of Rome stretched before him. The Forum gleamed faintly in the distance, The rooftops caught the last golden threads of light. Smoke curled lazily from hearths and braziers. The Tiber shimmered, winding like an old ribbon toward the darkening hills. The sound of the city, always there, always just beyond, came softly to his ears. A mule's bray, a merchant's call, the clink of a blacksmith's work, familiar noises, comforting. And yet, he remained in the archway a little longer. Something about the Colosseum pulled at him still. He turned back for a final glance. From here, the arena was partly hidden, but enough remained visible. The tall, outer walls, the arched entrances, the towering facade carved with history and memory. A few final spectators still emerged from its belly, blinking into the twilight. He realized then how silent it had become. Thousands had departed, yet it felt as though the Colosseum had swallowed their voices and left only a hum, as though the stone itself wished to be alone now, to remember quietly, to rest until morning. He stepped into the open air. The breeze caught his tunic and cooled his skin. A flock of birds wheeled above the amphitheater, their wings catching the orange glow as they flew in lazy spirals. One landed on the shoulder of a broken statue near the entrance, blinking slowly at the departing humans. To the side of the main road, vendors had begun packing away their goods. Barrels of vinegar water were sealed. Baskets of unsold dates were tied shut. One woman offered him a small honey cake for half price. He bought it without words and took a slow bite, letting the sweetness linger on his tongue. Further along the road, groups began to split. Some turned toward the Forum, others toward the Subura or the Palatine Hill. A few remained standing together, as if reluctant to part, still replaying moments from the matches, still lost in the golden silence of the closing gates. He walked alone, not quickly, not slowly, just enough to let the warmth of the day begin to settle into memory. At the edge of a small plaza, he stopped and looked back one final time. The Colosseum stood behind him, tall and pale against the deepening sky. Its arches, once brilliant in sunlight, now caught the moon's early glow. It looked like a giant breathing in sleep, still alive even in quiet. And he felt something stir within him. Not pride, not sadness, but a fullness. He had come to see the games, but he had found something else. He had witnessed a day of ritual and rhythm, where life and death danced in the dust. He had sat among strangers and heard them become a single voice. He had watched men rise and fall, not only with blades, but with grace. He had been part of something larger than himself. And now, with the city stretching out before him and the night rising slow and patient, he walked into Rome again, but not as he had come. He walked as one who remembered. The road from the Colosseum curved gently downward. The young man moved with the pace of someone who no longer had to hurry. The crowd had thinned into loose clusters and solitary walkers. The occasional voice rose above the hush. A laugh, a name called out. But the energy of the games had softened into the calm hush of evening. Shadows draped themselves across the cobblestones. The street lamps, set in tall iron frames, flickered to life one by one. Their flames shimmered against the stone walls, throwing warm pools of gold into the cooling air. Smoke from distant cook fires curled lazily toward the sky. He passed a pair of temple columns on his right. The temple of Venus and Roma, majestic, even in partial darkness, stood like an ancient sentinel watching over the road. Its marble surfaces glowed faintly, touched by moonlight. Somewhere beyond its steps, a group of young musicians sat with a lyre and a reed flute, playing soft melodies that echoed like memory down the stone corridors. He turned left, following the road toward the Forum. And as he walked, the mood around him changed. The Forum was the heart of Rome, not just its political core, but its spiritual and emotional one. It was here that victories were paraded, judgments handed down, laws shouted into the air. But at night, it became something gentler, a place of ghosts, The first thing he saw was the Arch of Titus, rising in pale white against the night sky. Stood silent, bearing reliefs of a long-past triumph. The sack of Jerusalem, the spoils of war carved into its surface. He passed beneath it slowly. His hand brushed the cool stone, and he felt a chill, not from cold, but from the strange nearness of history itself. Beyond the arch, the Forum opened before him. Paved paths stretched between broken columns. Statues stood in shadows. Shrines, some still maintained, others crumbling, lined the roads. The moon caught on bronze and marble alike, turning the ruins into monuments of stillness. And among it all, people moved. Not many, just enough to remind him that Rome never truly slept. A man in a hooded cloak read from a scroll by lamplight, seated beside the steps of the Curia. Two lovers held hands near the remnants of the temple of Castor and Pollux, their heads close, their words soft and meaningless to any but them. An old woman walked slowly along the edge of the rostra, whispering prayers to statues long forgotten. The young man walked without direction. The Forum asked nothing of him. It was not like the Colosseum, which demanded attention, reaction, judgment. The Forum invited only presence. He passed a broken column near the center of the plaza. There, someone had left a wreath, not of laurel, but of woven wheat stalks and wildflowers. A ribbon, weathered by sun and time, was tied in a loose knot. He paused there, sensing something both sacred and unknown. The stones beneath his feet bore deep grooves, centuries of carts and sandals carving lines into the earth. He imagined how many had walked this path before him. Senators in purple trimmed, togas, merchants calling out their prices, lawyers debating loudly beneath balconies, priests in procession, farmers offering produce at dawn, and now, him, just one of many, yet not lost in the many, because this city had a way of remembering not only the names carved into stone, but also the unnamed hearts that passed quietly through its breath. He reached the Temple of Saturn. Its columns, tall and severe, stood like pillars holding up the sky. In daylight, it was a place of bustle. At night, it was still. He sat on the steps. Around him, the Forum whispered. Distant voices, far-off songs, the soft creak of wood in carts, the scurry of a stray cat along the stones, and in his mind, the arena returned. He saw the net fighter, again, leaping lightly across the sand. He saw the lion, pacing in the sunlight. He saw Gaius, helmet tucked under one arm, bowing to the people, crowned not in gold, but green. And he saw the eyes of Varius, proud and silent to the end. All of it remained with him, not as noise, but as shape, not as spectacle, but as story. A warmth touched his hand. He looked down. A stray dog had approached, thin but not starving. Its eyes were large, curious. He reached into his pouch and broke off a piece of his honey cake, placing it on the step. The dog sniffed it, then ate slowly, as though savoring. Together, they sat in silence. Above, the stars had begun to sharpen. The sky, once glowing, had darkened into velvet. Rome settled further into itself. Somewhere, a night guard called out the hour. He did not yet want to leave, not because the day had been so grand, but because its ending felt too sacred to rush. Finally, the dog rose and wandered away, its tail flicking once as it disappeared between two pillars. He smiled and stood. He took one last long look at the Forum, and then, with steady steps, turned toward the path that would lead him home. The stars had come fully now. They clung to the Roman sky like flecks of silver scattered across black silk. The moon, round and high, cast a pale sheen over tile roofs and marble statues. Lamps flickered from doorways and alley walls, illuminating the narrow paths that twisted through the city's beating heart. The young man walked these streets slowly. He had no pressing reason to rush, no place he had to be. The games were over, but the night had just begun. Around him, Rome shifted, its daytime bustle replaced by the softer rhythm of evening. Some shops remained open, bakers selling the last of their loaves, a fruit stall offering overripe figs at a whisper of their morning price. A seamstress with eyes like polished coins sat beneath her awning, finishing a hem by lantern light. But the brightest corners now belonged to the taverns. Their doors swung wide, voices spilled into the streets. Laughter danced across the cobblestones like sparks from a hearth. Smoke drifted from kitchen fires, carrying with it the scent of roasted meat, wine, and wood ash. He passed one such tavern, a small, low-roofed place built of stone and cedar. A carved sign above the door read, "The Tired Wolf." Inside, it glowed. The light from within was warm and golden, alive with motion. The sound of a lyre hummed beneath the voices, gentle but steady. Someone laughed, a deep, full sound that rolled like thunder softened by distance. The young man hesitated. Then, with a quiet breath, he stepped inside. The heat struck him first, not harsh, but embracing, like stepping into the arms of an old friend. The warmth of fire, of people, of life. The walls were hung with faded tapestries. The floor was scattered with straw. A fire crackled in a hearth along the far wall. A few patrons looked up, nodded, then returned to their cups. A man behind the counter, middle-aged, round-bellied, with a beard flecked by ash, smiled and gestured toward an empty seat near the hearth. "Wine?" he asked. The young man nodded. "Red, watered." The tavern keeper poured the drink with practiced ease, then placed it gently before him. No questions, no chatter, just the quiet understanding that night was a time for resting more than speaking. He sipped. The wine was earthy, mild, not elegant, but honest. It warmed the throat and loosened the tension from his shoulders. He leaned back and let the sound of the room wash over him. Near the center table, 3 men were deep in conversation. I tell you, Varius should have lived. He had the heart, even if he lost. "No, no," said the second. "Cassian's strike was perfect, the kind of ending you only see once in a season." "And the editor?" asked the third, lowering his voice. "They say he's being watched for favoring certain schools." The others leaned closer, their voices faded into the background. In another corner, a woman sang softly, not for the room, but for herself. The tune was old, a lullaby perhaps, or a morning song. Her voice wrapped around the walls like smoke. The young man watched it all. These were not nobles or senators, not warriors or priests, just Romans, the people who gave the city its shape, who watched the games, who laughed, who ate, who remembered. Each person here carried their own version of the day. Some spoke of blood, some spoke of beauty, some, like him, spoke not at all, but carried it like a weight in their chest, warm and aching. The tavern keeper returned with a small plate, roasted chickpeas, salted and warm. He placed it before the young man without charge. "On the house," he said. "You've got the look of someone who saw more than he expected." The young man met his gaze. "I didn't expect to feel anything." "After," the tavern keeper nodded. "That's the trick of it. It leaves you quieter than when you came." A pause. Then he added, "But not empty." He moved away, leaving the young man with his thoughts. He reached for a chickpea, placed it on his tongue, and chewed slowly. The salt grounded him. The warmth reminded him he was still here, still breathing, still remembering. At the next table, a young couple argued gently about whether they should return tomorrow. A group of workers, still dusted from labor, sang half a verse of a sailor's song before forgetting the words. Someone told a joke too loudly and was hushed by laughter, and the young man sitting quietly listened to it all. The Colosseum was miles away now, or so it seemed, but its shadow still touched every corner of this room, in the way people spoke, in what they didn't say, in the stories they passed between one another, like bread or wine. He finished his drink. The fire burned low. Outside, the streets had quieted further. The city dimmed like a lantern turned low. Only the soft scuff of footsteps, the distant roll of a cart, and the steady breath of Rome itself remained. He stood, placed a small coin on the counter, and nodded to the keeper, who nodded in return, without a word. And then he stepped back into the night. The stars were sharper now, burning steadily overhead. The wind had cooled. The stones beneath his sandals were damp with dew. He walked without aim, letting the city carry him. Tonight, Rome was not a place of empires or gods. It was a place of voices, of firelight, of stories half told in smoky corners. And as he passed, under a narrow archway and disappeared into the winding streets, he felt not like a spectator, but a part of something far older and far more human. The streets were nearly empty now. A few voices still flickered through the alleyways, one last cart clattering over stone, a late drinker humming to himself, the soft clink of a lantern being hung near a doorway. But for the most part, the world had grown still. The young man walked the final stretch alone. The narrow path wound past a closed bakery, its shutters drawn, its chimney cooling. A stray dog curled against the wall. An amphora leaned against a doorpost, catching rainwater that had not fallen. His dwelling was humble, a single-room apartment above a small workshop that smelled faintly of leather and damp straw. He pushed open the wooden door with care. It gave a small creak, not unpleasant, like a familiar voice greeting him in the dark. Inside, the air was cool. He lit the oil lamp and set it on the low table by the window. It flickered unevenly, casting a gentle gold across the plastered walls and worn floor. The window remained ajar, letting in a thread of breeze and the faint sounds of Rome folding into rest. He removed his sandals, washed his face with the water, left in a clay bowl, and took a seat on the straw mat that served as his bed. He did not lie down. Not yet. Instead, he stared at the window, the little piece of night framed in wood and stone. The stars were visible, clearer now than before. They shimmered with quiet dignity, as if they too had watched the day's events from on high. His mind was full, too full for speech, too full even for thought. So much had happened, so much had been seen. He felt it in his limbs, his breath, the rhythm of his heartbeat, the roar of the crowd, the glitter of armor, the sharp silence after a final blow, the smell of dust, sweat, wine and blood. He reached for the lamp, turned down the wick, and the room dimmed further. He lay back slowly. The straw rustled beneath him. The walls seemed to lean closer, not in threat, but in intimacy, as though the room itself knew he needed quiet. Not sleep just yet, but stillness, and in that stillness, dreams found him. The dream was soft at first. He stood again in the Colosseum, but it was not as it had been. It was empty, no crowd, no trumpets, no blood, just the structure itself, vast, glowing in starlight, every arch lit by moonbeam, every stone humming faintly with memory. He stood barefoot on the sand. It was smooth beneath him, warm despite the night. A breeze moved across the arena floor, lifting small curls of dust like whispered ghosts. He looked upward. The velarium was gone, and the sky stretched above him, wide, eternal, brimming with stars. They blinked gently, like watchful eyes, each one a memory held in light. Then, slowly, shapes began to appear. Figures, not alive, not threatening, just present. A gladiator with a dented helmet, a beast with watchful eyes, a child holding a carved wooden sword, a man in a toga, hand raised in judgment, a woman carrying olives through the upper tier. They did not speak. They simply stood, like constellations given form, each one a piece of the day, a fragment of what he had seen, a moment suspended in dream. He turned and saw himself in the stands. The very seat he had taken earlier that morning now held another version of him, wide-eyed, leaning forward, mouth slightly open in awe, and then the sand beneath his feet began to shift, not violently, gently, and from it, something grew, a single green laurel sprout, delicate, alive. He knelt beside it, touched its leaves, felt something rise in his chest, not pride, not sorrow, something softer, recognition. The arena was not just a place of death, it was a place of witness, and those who witnessed carried something forward, even in dreams. He woke before dawn, no trumpet, no voices, just the sound of wind brushing the edge of the window and the quiet breath of a city not yet stirring. The oil lamp had burned out. The room was dim, but not dark. A faint light, silver blue, crept along the floorboards. He sat up, rubbed his eyes, and listened. Nothing. And everything. He reached beside the mat, took a piece of parchment and a bit of charcoal, and began to draw. The curve of an arch, the shape of a net in flight, the laurel wreath, and a single sprout growing from sand. He did not know why, only that he needed to. When he was done, he set the parchment aside, lay back once more, and this time, sleep came easily. Outside, Rome held its breath. A few lamps still flickered, but most were dark. The Colosseum stood in moonlight, silent now, its gates closed, its sand smooth. But inside that sand, dreams moved, not of violence, not of glory, but of memory and of the ones who would return, not to fight, not to cheer, but simply to remember. The first light of dawn touched the rooftops of Rome with silver. It was not yet loud, not yet the Rome of wheels and bells and voices, but the city was stirring. A breeze from the west curled between alleyways. Doors opened, curtains shifted. The scent of baking bread began to seep into the streets. Inside a small room above a tanner's shop, the young man sat up from his straw mat. He did not wake with a start, nor with haste. He simply opened his eyes as the day arrived, calm and steady, as though sleep had only been a deeper kind of thought. He looked around the room. The parchment on which he'd drawn in the night was still there, the lines faint in the morning dim. He ran his fingers over the edge, then stood. He washed his face with the last of the water from the clay jug. The coolness revived him. He stretched, listening to his shoulders crack softly in the quiet. He dressed with slow hands, buckled his sandals, and stepped to the window. The view was simple: chimneys, tiles, a single bird hopping along a roof beam. Far off, the dome of the Temple of Jupiter shimmered like a pearl touched by fog. And faintly, there stood the distant rise of the Colosseum, its arches pale and silent now, like ribs of a sleeping giant. He watched it for a while, then turned, took the drawing he'd made, rolled it into a small tube, and tucked it into his pouch. The streets below were still cool with dew. He stepped into them gently, joining the early morning rhythm of Rome. The streets were not yet busy. A few bakers shouted to one another across courtyards. Children chased chickens through alleys. A man with a broom swept leaves from a shrine step. But beneath the quiet, something else stirred. A kind of residue, not physical, but emotional. The day before still hovered in the city's breath. The games, the blood, the cries, the silences. It lived not just in memory, but in the way people moved today, slower, more thoughtful, as though they too were carrying invisible weight. The young man made his way back toward the Colosseum, not out of obligation, but out of something quieter, a need to see what the place looked like now. With the crowd gone and the dust settled, as he approached, he noticed things he hadn't before. The vendors' stalls were closed. A few were being packed, others already cleared away. The streets near the arena were empty, save for a few guards and laborers. The laughter and chants of the day before had faded into wind, and yet the Colosseum still stood as it had, unmoved, timeless. Its arches caught the rising light. Its columns bore shadows like old bruises. Birds nested along its upper reaches. A pair of dogs trotted past, uninterested. The gates were closed, but not barred. A custodian, draped in simple linen, sat near one entrance, darning a torn sandal. The young man approached. The custodian looked up. His eyes were sharp but kind. "You came to see what remains?" he asked. The young man nodded. The older man stood slowly and opened a narrow side gate. "Go on," he said, "but don't stay long. She sleeps now." The young man entered. Inside, the Colosseum was utterly changed, not in form, but in presence. No voices, no motion, just space. The arena was empty. The sand, raked and dampened, bore no prints. The air was cool and smelled of earth and stone. The seats above were quiet, like the rows of an abandoned amphora. He stood at the edge of the railing. Below, where Gaius had stood, where the beasts had run, where blood had soaked into soil, there was now only stillness. And yet, he felt it all. He heard the distant clash of steel, the roar that followed mercy, the hush that swallowed the fallen. And he heard, too, the quiet chant of a name spoken not in frenzy, but in love. He closed his eyes, and for a moment breathed with the place. When he opened them, the light had shifted. The sun now reached the far side of the arena, warming the stones like a touch from above. He bowed his head, not to the gods, nor to the emperor, but to the space itself, to the lives remembered, to the stories written not in ink, but in movement and breath and sand. Then he turned and left. The custodian nodded as he passed. "Some come for glory," he said. "Some for judgment, but the ones who return after." He smiled faintly. "They come for the truth." The young man said nothing, but he carried those words with him. Back in the street, the city had awakened more fully. Carts creaked, horses nickered. The baker near the square had begun selling warm rolls. A boy sang as he delivered laundry. The day had begun. But for the young man, something was different now. Not lost, not changed entirely, but deepened. He was no longer simply one who had watched the games. He was one who had stayed long enough to feel what remained, and in that, he carried something Rome itself would never forget. The morning air felt sharp and serene. Sunlight tiptoed over rooftops. The scents of dew-washed stone and olive blossoms mixed softly. From distant courtyards came the murmur of conversations. Pledges shared, prayers whispered, decisions weighed under quiet arches. Our traveller moved with purpose, not haste. He passed silent shops and quiet homes, carrying with him a sense renewed by the dawn. The experience of yesterday, its grandeur and its sorrow, had not been left behind. Instead, it shaped him, made him thoughtful, searching. He soon reached the Forum, but he did not linger in its stately columns or echoing halls. Instead, he crossed it to reach Capitoline Hill, where the great temple of Jupiter overlooked the city in patient majesty. Stairs climbed steeply, polished smooth by centuries of footsteps. He joined a small assembly already at the top. Faces turned toward the grand bronze doors, cloaked figures bearing herbs, children gripping coins, soldiers in leather armor bowed in realization. All came with hopes too private to voice. At the temple's base, the scent of incense spiraled skyward, soft and sticky in the still air. Between polished columns, the sunlight made patterns, framing among their lines other travelers moving like thoughts whispered aloud. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate. A temple priest met him at the entrance, white-robed and composed. "You carry yesterday's weight," the priest said, not question but statement. Then, "Offer to lay it down." Our traveller reached inward. Out came the parchment from which he drew the arena's curves, the laurel sprout, the lone figure. No words, just charcoal lines, trembling in places yet still clear enough to evoke memory. He placed the paper gently at the bowl's edge, a vessel filled with sacred flame. The priest inclined his head. Wind stirred the edges of drawing, and then the edges curled. Ink turned black at first, and then turned flame white, consumed. Ash drifted downward and joined the embers at the bottom. The priest stepped back. "You have given," he said. "Now wait." Our traveller remained as dawn brightened into day. He watched others bring their own offerings, strings of peppered nuts, bundles of dried herbs, copper coins stamped with emperors he did not know. Some offered tears, some offered laughter. All came seeking, indeed Rome herself, every breath long, new meaning in these moments between letting go and beginning again. When the cycle felt complete, he descended. But he was still restless. He had carried his burden up the hill. He had entrusted his question to flame, yet he felt neither relieved nor answered. So he turned north across the ancient streets toward a smaller shrine hidden in a quiet courtyard. The Vicus Fortunae, Fortune's crossroad, named for a goddess who could bless or bewilder, whose favor often walked in visible lines, there stood a statue, a woman carved of smooth marble, arm outstretched as if to pour fate into mortal hands. At her feet were coins, woven herbs, scraps of cloth, even dice carved of bone. Our traveller approached. From his pouch he drew a single as, a coin stamped with an indistinct bust, worn by use. The shrine priestess, silent and gentle, watched him. He placed the coin on the stone ledge. Then, almost without conscious thought, he whispered, "May what comes come with grace." He expected nothing, but fate is cunning. As he stepped away, the bell over the courtyard gate gave a sharp chime. Whether by wind or guest, he couldn't tell. A gust of breeze covered the coin in sand, obscuring its imprint, the dread and promise of the moment knit together, an omen or chance, or perhaps both. He did not linger. Noon approached, but Rome still moved gently. The bright sun climbed higher. Shadows receded. The hum of daily routines resumed. From the gardens below, he heard sprinklers' soft hiss. Near the aqueduct, women bickered over water rights. Market banter floated over roofs, rising like warmed smoke. The city felt alive. Life, he realized, lived in both spectacle and silence, in offering and in remaining unmoved. Exhausted, he returned home. He sat again at his low table, removing sandals slowly. The parchment, now in ash, weighed nothing, yet its absence felt heavier than the charcoal had. He poured water into a cup and drank it with intent to cleanse, to ground, to acknowledge. What he had given was gone. What he had asked remained unspoken. Yet in the act, something shifted. He reflected. The gods do not shout. They speak in ember and echo, in coins rolled quiet and parchments consumed. They remind mortals that meaning often arises in the moments of stillness between giving and waiting. He stood and looked out the open window. The city glowed. The midday sun washed the rooftops, illuminating dusty beams and tiles. Somewhere a song rose, lone voice calling across balconies, rhythm of a life unbroken by grandeur or grief. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, feeling ancient winds, dust, worship, and wonder gather in the air. He had walked through sacrifice and silence. He had touched the hunger of the gods. He had offered what he could, and in that offering, flame born of asphalt and stone, he found a kind of peace. The late afternoon air carried a gentle warmth. Shadows leaned gently against walls. The streets were less crowded now, fewer voices weaving through them, fewer wheels rattling overhead. Rome felt ready to rest, but our traveller lingered deliberately, moving deeper into quieter quarters. He walked without haste, but with intent, past small gardens grown wild between blocks, past the occasional artist's courtyard filled with half-carved statues, past shuttered workshops where tools had long since cooled. Each step drew him farther from the city's heart and closer to something smaller, more personal. He stopped at a quiet stone archway. Even at midday, it would have been easy to pass without noticing. But now, in the golden haze of evening, it called to him. He slipped beneath it. A small path, lined with clusters of wild thyme and oregano, led him downward. The hum of the city softened to a distant breath. Then, at the end of the path, he arrived. A practice arena. Circular stone rim, half buried in earth. No tiers of marble, no stands, no audience. Only the stillness of sandstone and the rustle of wind-stirred herbs. Here, gladiators once practiced their craft, repeating drills and sparring under the sun. But now it was empty, quiet enough to feel its own echo, dusty enough to hold memory beneath its surface. He stepped onto the broken stone threshold. The air smelled faintly of dirt and thyme, both sweet and grounding. The sand beneath his feet was fine, cool from shade, and scarred by centuries of careful raking. He entered the circle slowly. Inside, he stood still. No audience watched him. No trumpet sounded. Just the hush of a solitary space. The sky above, visible through open air, soothed him. He knelt, touched the sand. There was nothing written here, no names, no lines. But between his fingers, he felt history. The question wasn't what the sand held, but what it released. So he sat and drew. First, a curve. Soft, like the trace of a hand in dust. Then, arcs. Each motion shaped by memories he carried. The graceful turn of a net thrown in the arena. The step of a swordsman. The rise and bow of Gaius at his triumph. He didn't sketch people. He sketched movement. Silence. Breath. With careful slowness, he traced the looping sweep of a gladiator's net against still air. The clean, sudden dive of a blade stopping, mid-air. The slow exhale of a fighter before the first strike. The curve of an arch in the Colosseum's tiers, like a silent witness. The slight incline of sand before the first drop of blood. Each line was a phrase. Each curve, a whisper. Here, he was not recreating spectacle. He was remembering, and the sand understood. He worked in silence. No need for words, no need for applause. His hand moved like water over glass, sometimes quick, sometimes hesitant. Each line held weight. Each space between lines felt just as loud. Time passed. Sunlight shifted its angle above the open sky. Shadows crept across the arena floor. A bird landed. At the rim pecked and took flight again, but the traveler remained still, engaged in this quiet conversation. He did not trace everything he remembered. He traced only what stayed alive in thought. A gesture, a moment, a pause. When he paused, the patterns looked imperfect, but not to him. To him, they held meaning. They held weight. They spoke of a Rome that was lived, not only in roar and blood, but in breath and memory. He closed his eyes, felt the lines beneath his fingers, remembered the way the sand gave under a warrior's foot, remembered the moment before a roar, remembered when everyone fell still, remembered when someone's life shifted on sand. Finally, he stood. He looked at the drawing. It made no sense to a casual observer, but to him, it was everything. He knelt again and gently smoothed his hand over the lines. The sand shifted at his touch. The patterns blurred. He stepped back. The sand returned to quiet. Memory remained. He retraced his path out of the arena. The sky had deepened. Evening was in full bloom. No torches burned here. No guides. Just the hush of stone and the moon rising behind olive trees. He paused once more at the rim. No footprints marked the sand beside his. None needed. The language had passed. Back on the dusty street, he rejoined the hum of the city's edge. Evening deepened. Music drifted from courtyards. Lanterns gleamed from windows. Voices rose and fell. Fires burned in hearths. Life resumed around him, but he carried something different, something calm, something quiet, something ancient. That night, in his small room, he left the lamp unlit. He looked moonward from the open window. He reached down and touched a coin, felt its cool weight, remembered his offerings. Then he closed his eyes. The dreams that came were quiet, not ghosts, not visions, but the echo of what had been written and gently erased, the movement of sand, the hush of memory, the breath before Rome roared and he slept. The city slumbered. The moon watched. The sand held its own story, in language no one may speak, but that everyone carries. Once they returned from the arena, the moon hung full and low above the rooftops, like a sentinel watching over the sleeping city. Its light poured gently, washing the tired stones in pale silver. Shadows softened, details blurred. Rome itself seemed to breathe in slow, steady rhythms, as though awakening to its truest self. Our traveller moved without destination. He wandered through familiar streets that now felt foreign in their stillness. Doorways that had witnessed daytime bustle now slept behind heavy shutters. The hum of commerce had quieted to faint echoes. And all around, the city breathed low and deep. He passed beneath an aqueduct arch where creeping vines draped ancient stone. The moonlight caught on damp patches, turning them to shimmering ribbons. No carving demanded attention. No statue required reverence. Just a slow rhythm of footfalls and breath. The expansive forum lay ahead, still vast and empty. His footfalls whispered across the stones, some polished smooth by centuries of sandals, others chipped by time. The grand columns stood like silent witnesses, their shadows stretched long across the square. There was no applause here, only the echo of stillness. He paused. A faint melody drifted on the night breeze, like a half-forgotten lullaby. Not from a tavern, but from an open window hidden among the ruins. A lone musician, perhaps, strumming a lyre by candlelight. The notes were soft and hushed, just enough to colour the silence, not disrupt it. He walked toward it, not in search of company, but in search of warmth. The melody beckoned him to a narrow winding street framed by ivy-covered walls. There, behind a curtained balcony, soft chords rose and fell. They carried something ancient, a sense that this city, even in its sleep, remembered every melody sung beneath its skies. The traveller stopped near the balcony, letting the music wash over him. He didn't linger long, for it wasn't his story to hear. He simply nodded once, as one nods to a passing star, then moved on. Down a small alley, he found another courtyard newly lit by lanterns. A single fountain stood at its centre, water, having long since dried from its basin. Yet the still surface reflected the lantern flame and moonlight like a mirror to the sky. A fig tree extended its branches overhead, leaves trembling slightly in the evening breeze. He stood in the courtyard's centre, letting the calm settle around him. He thought of the games, of the roar, of the hush, of the blood, of the mediations and offerings, of the sand and the drawing, of the city that watched all of it. The courtyard offered a counterpoint, a place where nothing happened, yet everything resonated. He closed his eyes. He felt, rather than heard, the pulse of Rome, even now, a gentle breathing of memory and stone. Time moved without urgency. He followed a stair down, dragging him toward the river. The Tiber glimmered in its slow night current, dark in the deeper waters, silvered at the edges. Lanterns across its banks flickered off one by one as boat traffic ceased. Moonlight caught on the ripples, turning them to trembling shards of light. He rested on the bridge's stone ledge, thinking of how many had stood here before him, lovers, senators, travelers, slaves. Every footstep carried across the water. Every voice echoed in moon and memory. A dog padded by, silent and graceful. It paused near him, then continued on, vanishing into the night's tapestry. From across the river, the traveller noticed the silhouette of the Colosseum, distant but undeniable. Against the dark sky, it rose like a sleeping colossus, its arches breathtaking, inviting even in abandonment. No torches burned there, no sails of the velarium fluttered, only pale stones glowed in the moonlight, stark and honourable. He remained until dawn felt near. Then he turned and retraced his steps, back through the courtyard, past the fig tree, up the lantern-lit street, and back toward his rented home. The city had shifted again, now faintly caressed by early morning light. Some lanterns remained lit. Dogs yapped at unseen ghosts of night. Doors opened to early birds. He paused outside his door. The dawn would come soon, bringing new voices and busier streets. But for this moment, he rested, not yet turning his keys, not yet entering his space. He closed his eyes, felt the residue of moonlight on his skin, listened to the far-off song of the city waking, and breathed deeply. Back inside, he removed his sandals and sat near his open window. A single ray of morning sun peeked on the threshold, brushing the floor in rose gold. He didn't sleep again. He didn't turn on his lamp. He simply listened to the last breaths of night, to the memory of stone, to the hush that came after moon and music. Rome had told him something tonight, not through oration, not through spectacle, but through gentleness, through memory carried in silence. And in that, he found a kind of peace. He rose, closed the window's shutters slowly, and stepped into the dawn. The dawn broke gently over Rome, not with commotion, but with a tender glow that peeled back the night layer by layer. A distant cuckoo called. Smoke curled from hearths. Curtains fluttered in the breeze. Day began, yet something felt changed. The traveller stepped into the morning light. It was not the sun that caught his gaze, but the emptiness that filled it. No lines of spectators heading toward the arena. No heralds or musicians in gleaming tunics. Even the vendors who typically greeted him with smiles and salt-caked loaves were absent. Their absence was silent, but deep. This was the day without games. He made his way to the Colosseum. Walking along stone roads easy to tread, he kept his pace mindful, neither rushed nor late, just a man arriving in the presence of stillness. The streets had life but lacked the previous day's edge. No clatter of preparation, no repetitious cries of domandia, the call of today's games. At the edge of its immense shadow, he stopped. Rising before him, the Colosseum glowed faintly in the early light, its arches void of banners, empty of expectation. The gates remained closed. No footfalls echoed within its corridors. He circled the structure slowly. At each arch, he paused. No statues greeted him here. No ceremonies announced his presence. He simply stood and looked at moss-crusted stone, ivy-clad edges, weathered walls that held 1,500 years of sun and storm. In that silence, he felt the weight of eras. He found a shaded bench beneath a grove of olive trees. Their leaves whispered overhead. The ground was cool, the breeze soft enough to chase the worry from his shoulders. He settled in. No one demanded applause. No one beckoned attention. He was simply present. It was enough. His eyes drifted to a child nearby. The boy traced patterns, in the dust with a twig, a small echo of yesterday's celebration, but without ceremony. A mother watched, serene. No crowd, no roar, just simple presence. In that moment, the traveller perceived subtle truths. The Colosseum, built for spectacle, became gentle when it did not perform, not diminished, grown wise. Nearby, 3 labourers repaired stone steps. Their tools tapped softly, onyx tones of hammer on chisel, restoring what had once carried footfalls of crowds. Their work was respectful. No rallying chants, no hurried rhythm, just slow, care restoration, not erasure. He closed his eyes, listening, not to echoes of screams or cheers, but to the soft song of presence, the bird that sang unseen, the olive leaves brushing together, the distant hum of Rome's waking day. Silence can be its own performance. Time drifted, shade shifted. The child's drawings remained blooming in dust. The workman's tools continued their quiet song across stone. The world resumed, but here it paused. And in that pause, he too could breathe, understand, see. Eventually, he rose. The morning grew brighter. Birds flitted from branch to branch. Vendors arranged produce. Carts rolled. The city's pulse returned meekly. But here, the silence stayed. He walked again, further around the perimeter, past alcoves where shrines had been placed in memory of those lost to spectacle. Candles, coins, faded ribbons tied to the stones. Small gestures whispered from visitors before him. He paused at one, a crudely painted portrait of a gladiator, clay faces pressed to the wall. Beneath, Memoria semper vivat. May the memory always live. It stirred him. This pause, this quiet day, was not absence. It was remembrance. It asked not for cheers, but for reflection. When he finally stepped away, Rome had fully stirred. Bars opened. Children ran errands. Priests led prayers. The hum grew. Life returned. He followed the flow. Back home, he drank a warm cup of spiced wine, lighter than the day before, but enough to carry him inward. He stared at the remains of parchment on his table, his charcoal maps of sand and arches and breathing, stone. The strength of absence weighed in his chest. He realized that silence carries its own kind of echo. That stillness can reveal what noise hides, that the grandeur of a moment lives on, not just in spectacle, but in the pause that follows. He picked up pen and paper, not to describe battles, but to trace the day's hush, writing slowly. Today, the Colosseum slept. No crowds, no sand disturbed, but in its silence, it spoke more clearly than ever. It reminded me that space between moments is where we truly remember who we are. He smiled. The games would return, but he did not fear it. For now, he had learned. He put down the pen, stepped toward the window, saw the city moving beneath the emerging sun. Rome was not gone. It had just, for a moment, quietly exhaled. He closed his eyes, softly, and in that quiet, he felt it fully. The eternal pause, where memory lingers longest. The sun set softly over the rooftops of Rome. Its light gilded the edges of tiles and caught on the eaves of aging columns. The sky blushed in tones of apricot and rose, then faded gently toward twilight. Below, the city pulsed in slower rhythms. Final errands, late conversations, doors creaking open and shut. In his quiet room, the traveller stood before his window. He had not visited the Colosseum that day. He hadn't needed to. It lived inside him now, not only as place, but as presence. He looked out across the rooftops and thought not of the next games, but of the ones he had seen. Memory does not arrive all at once. It returns in fragments, softened by time. A trumpet's call just before the gate opened. The way a lion hesitated, paw on blood-dark sand. The weight of a wooden bench beneath him. The moment before mercy. The wind that passed through the arches and scattered doves skyward. These were his now. Not as trophies, but as threads, woven into the fabric of what it meant to witness, to see, and not forget. He sat at the low table. There, among scribbled sketches and folded parchment, lay his final piece of charcoal. He picked it up and held it a moment, feeling its weight, its readiness, its patience. Then slowly, he began to draw. Not the arena this time, not the roar. He drew a curved arch with a single dove rising above it, a quiet figure below, head turned, upward. And beside it, a fig tree, its branches heavy, not with fruit, but with light. He did not finish the drawing. He did not need to. It was enough that it had begun. Later, he walked through Rome once more, past the Temple of Vesta, where the eternal flame still flickered in the dusk, past shuttered shops with faint lamplight inside, past a street performer playing a slow melody on a wooden flute, each note long, deliberate, gentle. The traveller paused and listened. The music was not for celebration, it was for memory, and in its hush, he felt it again, the lasting echo of the arena. Not the sound of applause, but the breath held just before. Not the crash of sword, but the moment after. The silence that remains. As he moved through the forum, the marble looked different in twilight. Not grander, quieter, softer. He passed, others all moving gently, faces calm, some smiling, some pensive. Everyone had been shaped in some way by what they had witnessed. But what they carried now was not the spectacle, it was the story. And stories once lived do not fade. They echo. He returned to the edge of the Colosseum. Its outline was shadow, now. Its arches held the evening like open hands. No guards stood by, no priests, no crowds, just ivy creeping up stone and moonlight waiting to bloom. He stood for a long time, not watching, listening. He thought of the sand, how it remembers each footprint, how it reshapes itself between each act, how it softens gently again and again, a stage, a grave, a cradle. He whispered a wordless thank you to the empty arches, then turned and walked away. He did not look back, because the Colosseum would always remain, in the way the wind caught the scent of time, in the hush of footsteps near olive trees, in the pause between two notes of a flute, in the hand that sketches a curve on parchment. Rome holds many things: victory, power, desire, but it also holds quiet, and in that quiet, memory, and in memory, truth. Back home, the traveller lit a single lamp. Its flame was soft. He placed the unfinished drawing beside it. Then, taking a breath, he lay down, not to sleep immediately, but to remember, to revisit the dove, the sand, the arch, the breath, the mercy, to let it all settle, like dust on ancient stone. The Colosseum had ended its story for now. But stories do not need arenas to survive. They need only one heart to remember. And that, dear friend, is enough.